Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support the podcast. Best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. I do a weekly analysis of world events and schedule as well for supporters only Zoom calls off the record where we shoot the breeze. It's sort of a therapy session. Joining us for the first time on Geopolitics and Empire is former Intelligence NCO and contractor Mike Shelby of Gray Zone Research. He's also founder of earlywarningnetwork.com. All of his links are in the description. He's on X at Gray Zone Intel, Substack at grayzoneresearch.substack.com. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
I've been a fan of your work. Happy to have you on. And before throwing questions at you, tell us about the work that you do at Gray Zone Research and Early Warning.
Yeah, well, we are trend analysts. I think everyone is just very concerned about where the United States is headed domestically, where the world is headed from a geostrategic, geoeconomic perspective. Lots of things are changing. We're on the cusp, the front edge of generational change. And so we try to make sense of that as best we can. At Early Warning Network, that's more focused on emergency preparedness, disaster response, information sharing at the local level. But, we produce an intelligence report every day for Early Warning. And we look at domestic political conditions. We look at civil unrest, what's going on with the protests, and maybe something far worse. And then the geopolitical and geostrategic angles as well.
Yeah, I think it's $9.99 a month, so it's probably worth more than I don't do Netflix, so better subscribe to Early Warning than Netflix. Or let me just ask you, I guess, looking at domestically, then, what's your just broad assessment of the state of the union of the U.S. As well as how would you assess the second Trump administration? Grade them. How do you see them doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think listen, there is no 100% being happy with Trump. Uncertainty is just part of his thing. It's what he does. He excels in periods of uncertainty because only he knows what he's going to do next. And I think he likes having the world and the other side of the political aisle, probably even the Republican Party, keep them on their toes too. So, in that way, I think you have to have maybe some sort of grading curve for the Trump administration. I think he's doing great on the national security stuff, shutting down the border, shutting down mass immigration, regaining national sovereignty. On the tariff front, I'm not sure. I mean, before we even get to tariffs, he's got this whole thing like rapprochement with Russia. I'm not sure to what level that's actually going to happen. I'm hopeful that he will end the war. On the tariff front, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he's trying to build kind of a tariff wall around China. Maybe he can do that with Europe. I somewhat doubt he does that with Asian countries that are kind of also economically dependent on China. So I think he's taking on two gargantuan geostrategic efforts, and I'm just not real sure how successful he's going to be in that.
I feel the same. It's why I have guests on from a range of professions to help us figure that stuff out. I can see things going either way, and there are many moving parts. And I do have further questions. I know you do on your YouTube channel, which people can go to. You do briefs there on some of these issues. I was looking at some recently. I do want to revisit the economy, but I guess one of the biggest questions I wanted to ask you, and I had on a guest recently, Pete Quinones, and some of his assessments seem to overlap with yours. Some people might think, Trump came in and we're out of the woods, so to speak. But no, you're talking about sort of like a Civil War 2.0, this color revolution stuff. I haven't been paying as much attention because I live outside of the U.S., but in Illinois, where I'm from, Pritzker coming out talking about There was that clip I think you saw. I shared it as well. That he's raising. I forget exactly what he said, but he wants the left to get ready to cause a ruckus. So basically, it seems like they're sharpening their knives and waiting for 2028. You also shared a video. I think it was Ezra and I forget who, Leah or someone, talking about the next election cycle. And so, what is the threat here that you see from the left and the potential for quote Civil War 2.0?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I use the term Civil War 2.0 because it's a phrase that everyone understands. I really, really dislike the term Civil War, though. I think what we've been dealing with, probably going back to 2008 to 2010, is this ramp up of the class war and the 1% and Occupy Wall Street. I think that was the beginning of what we call low intensity conflict. And so when I talk about Civil War 2.0, I'm not talking about 1861 or like another war between the states or any kind of large scale or conventional war. What I'm really talking about is low intensity conflict is conflict beneath the threshold of conventional war. So we're not talking about tanks and bombers. It's not World War II. It's not Russia, Ukraine, high intensity conventional wars. But it is a low intensity conflict is above routine peaceful competition. So we're not just talking about political warfare. So it exists in kind of the gray zone between war and peace. The United States is not at war with itself. We're definitely not at peace with ourselves either. And so low intensity conflict is an umbrella term that covers everything from violent social movements on the lower level up to terrorism, terror campaigns, guerrilla warfare, popular revolutions or color revolutions, up to armed insurgencies. And so I'm pretty sure the United States, we've already been dealing with the low level of it, violent social movements. We've been dealing with that off and on since 28. Obviously, 2016 to 2021 was another high water mark. I think there's a good chance that 2028 surpasses 2020 in terms of the intensity of the low intensity conflict. So it's not over. It's not done. I don't think we're going to move to tanks and bombers, but terrorism, some sort of a popular revolution. I think there's a very good chance that happens. Something like Euromaidan or the Arab Spring or something.
Could we even reference like back in the 60s and 70s, you had like Weather Underground, right? Carrying out these terror attacks. And then maybe to ask you the reason why we're here, how we got so divided. I mean, no country's perfect. No one is, 100%. There's always issues. But, when I grew up in the U.S. in the 90s, it didn't quite, feel like it does now. One of the things I look at to help explain it is our values have changed, right? I feel like there's this, I tend to refer to the left as these liberal globalists. They have this globalist ideology, much of which is against, anti-conservative, anti-God, anti-traditional. And that, it seems like the globalists, wherever they come from, they have infused our society in the U.S. in education. I worked in education, government, media. You look at the movies today, right? Business, it's all got that tinge of liberal globalist ideology. What's sort of your assessment of what's driving, this other half of the populace?
Well, I think part of it goes back to the neoconservative response after, well, some might say just prior to 9/11. But 9/11 was undeniably the turning point in American, for my lifetime at least. And everything we've seen there, everything we have seen since there is like a disintegration of, like you said, everything that seemed to be going pretty darn well back during the 90s. I think maybe some of that was illusory because you had 0% interest rates and illusory wealth being made. And that has continued since then, the illusory wealth part. So I think it was a response to 9/11 that probably marked the turning point. And then you get in 2009, the election of Barack Obama, the internationalist socialist extraordinaire. And it's like I don't know, I wouldn't say it's the rejuvenation of the Comintern program, but he was like the Manchurian candidate for all this stuff. And I would say that's kind of like the second big domino to fall in my lifetime, at least, where we start to see class warfare and we start to see racialist policies and the problems of race reemerge in the United States and the problems of race and class. And so I blame it on the Obama revolution. I mean, I think he started the ball rolling on that. Undeniably, he did. And we're dealing with the effects of that. And the whole goal is, you have to take down, I think if you're a globalist, you have to take the United States down a peg, because our society is, I mean, for all its successes and failures, we are the ones pushing national sovereignty. And I think the United States represents a big hurdle towards for the internationalists and globalists. And so in that regard, it really is kind of traditional societies versus the global societies.
Yeah, and many of my guests have said the same, and I often argue that I view multipolarity. We hear that word touted a lot by the Jeff Sachs and Alexander Dugin, and it's an unpopular opinion in alt media, but I view multipolarity as a form of New World Order, which is what you said. It's to bring America down a notch, and then to create these blocks, like that Orwell spoke about, to form the basis for world democratic socialist world state, as H.G. Wells wrote about over a century ago. I do want to ask you about intra-elite conflict. That's something you've discussed. You've referenced Peter Turchin's books. I've got them on my shelf, but I haven't read them yet. They've been sitting there for years. I think this also, I've got a lot of books as you do with all of these thinkers. I don't think none of them get it 100% right, but they'll have a key insight that is an extremely useful tool with which to gauge where we're at. And I like some of Turchin's, theories that he's come up with. Just thoughts on this intra-elite conflict within the U.S. and how, that's also affecting this disintegration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I find most beneficial from guys like Peter Turchin, and Turchin cites a guy named Jack Goldstone who talks about the same stuff, is that's effectively it's not only a historical trend, but it's kind of a mental model. It's a lens through which you can view current events. And so I think what Peter Turchin describes as intra-elite conflict, where you have a fracturing of elites. And this is not just a U.S. problem. This is, they cite hundreds of years of history. Goldstone cites 5 instances in the early modern era. And so you have this fracturing of elites, and whether, sometimes it's driven by competing ideologies, sometimes it's driven by elite overproduction, where a country is producing too many elites and not enough elite positions. Like in the lead up to the English Civil War is a really good example. If you think about the landed gentry families of England, you have, a father would have multiple sons, and he's only got so much land. And so typically the firstborn son would inherit most or all of the land. And then if you're a second or thirdborn son, you have a last name, but you don't have any land. You're not a landholder. And so you get this buildup of elites who have no elite positions. Like their kids are not going to be the same level as they are, or as they were. And so you get a bunch of pissed off elites, and they say, we're locked out of these elite positions. There is no way for us to remain in this elite class. They become counter elites. And like the Taiping Rebellion is another great example. You have these people, this guy that failed the Chinese civil service exam. He is functionally doomed to the peasantry because he has no upward economic mobility without being in the Chinese civil service. And he's like some religious nut, but he goes and starts a war, basically a civil war that kills 20 million Chinese people. So I look at the United States and I look at Donald Trump, and then, some of the other people, and I don't necessarily think they're locked out of elite positions, but I think it's pretty easy to see the past, a couple decades. I think white males have been going down that path of not getting into good universities, and now you're not going to get as good a job. And so that means your lifetime earning potential is reduced. And that means your quality of life is reduced and your standard of living is reduced. And I think that's a huge problem. And I think that's really a driver of that. Something that Obama also gifted us with, this thing called disparate impact. You can't do this because it negatively affects someone else, even though it's not you specifically doing it. At any rate, so I do think the United States is on that. We have seen a fracturing of the elites into two distinct elite classes: the elites and the establishment elites and the counter elites. And I think that's where we are. I think Turchin and Goldstone are right about that.
Let me ask you also, because I mean, we're looking at different variables here that are affecting the U.S. intra-elite conflict, the left sharpening their knives. There's talk about foreign interference. I think in many countries there are many foreign interests interfering. And in the U.S., there's been talk, of China, the intellectual property. We've seen clips of these Chinese businessmen, I'm sure you're familiar with, a few years ago, bragging about how much they've penetrated the cabinets, to use Cobra Commander Klaus Schwab's speech. Davos, penetrating the cabinets themselves, putting the consummate Davos man into power out there in Ottawa, Mark Carney. So I feel like a lot of people tend to focus, it's just the Chinese. And I'm like, well, okay, yes, there's Chinese, but there's also, the globalist transnational elite class, WEF, and others, maybe some Russian, maybe some, I don't know what. What have you seen? What do you feel for foreign interference in America? What's most threatening for you there?
Well, my biggest concern is that now everyone wants to get their claws into America. But I think Chinese elite capture is a huge problem. It's like pretty regularly now, DOJ comes out and they indict somebody else for like an American for foreign espionage, or it comes out that the Chinese were giving so and so money, some politician money under the table to influence local or state or regional or like national politics. So yeah, I'm pretty concerned that the Chinese, they obviously do have their claws in a lot of politicians, but I think a lot of it too is just domestic. Like you look at a lot of Republicans, even, like I say this from time to time, but I'm not really a Republican, but I don't go to their games, but if they're on TV, I'll root for them, kind of thing. But even then they go along to get along. And as long as they're making money, they kind of don't care, as long as they can stay in Congress and keep the gravy train rolling for them. So China is definitely a problem, but we got our own problems here with misaligned incentives from our own quote unquote leaders.
And I do want to, before going to other topics, I do want to ask, just going back to the future, what would happen with the Civil War 2.0, or the other terms that people use, I forget, but color revolution, right? I was it 4 years ago when I interviewed Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He actually predicted it when Trump lost the election. He had said it was like a reverse color revolution, Soros, the domestic revolution, stuff that we've been running abroad. It came home to roost. And what you think might this all look like, this process? Because I had a number of folks on the podcast. Dmitry Orlov, he's this Russian American. He's living back now in Russia. He's posited the U.S. would have like its own Soviet-style 1990s Russia collapse. I've interviewed the late Johan Galtung, founder of Peace and Conflict Studies. He predicted to the year in 1980. He said in 1990 the Soviet Union would collapse. It did. He said 2025 for the U.S. And for the American empire. He would say he's a fan of the U.S. Republic, not the empire. I've had on Michael Beckley, who's posited that America will remain the only superpower. Recently, I interviewed Edward Luttwak, who says, America will survive. And so I'm just trying to gauge what this integration might look like. It could be something like a 1990s Russia, but I also feel like America just has many things. It's such a strong beast that I feel I don't know. Again, I'm on the fence. I've had Peter Schiff on where it's like, yeah, we could lose a dollar status, hyperinflation, everything collapses, or it would just be we would just move down a notch. Just and any further thought on what this Civil War 2.0 could look like, and how bad could America, get it?
Mm-hmm. I share a lot of the concern that the United States is an empire that is in at least relative decline. I'm willing to give the Trump administration a couple of years. I mean, maybe past the midterms, we'll see. If the Democrats take the House in the midterms, all this stuff's going to be over. But I think the Trump administration is trying to do the right thing, but it's a reprieve from the end of Pax Americana. I think we're honestly probably in absolute decline. But the United States is so large militarily and economically and culturally. There's a lot of inertia that can keep the momentum rolling, I think, for a lot longer than people will think. But I look at Great Britain, not so great now, but they were once an empire and they collapsed. They're still around. The United States is different in a lot of ways. We have a lot of natural resources. There's a lot of talent and a lot of, still a lot of money and innovation that happens here. So I'm a little more optimistic that the United States will, maybe we will fracture, maybe we will balkanize. I think a lot of this stuff depends on what kind of leadership we have. But in terms of a color revolution, I don't think that is, well, that may be country ending, but a color revolution is a predominantly non-violent, people-led movement. It's social power. It's soft power as opposed to hard power. So it's not an armed revolution, and it's not a coup. It's a bunch of people in the street striking out at the three pillars of a government. It's legitimacy, capacity, and authority. And legitimacy is the recognized right of people to be in charge. So President Trump is legitimate because he was elected. And he doesn't have any of the legitimacy problems, at least not yet, that he had the first go around with, my Russia hoax and all this stuff. The second pillar that a color revolution strikes against is capacity. So, President Trump, in order to implement his policies, he's got to have the money to do that. He's got to have the manpower, the resources. And so what a color revolution is trying to do is sap the capacity of someone to be in power. And typically we're talking about bringing down dictators. I don't think Trump's a dictator, but it's the exact same approach. One big thing is you attack the economic conditions. So looking back in 2020, there's a whole shutdown DC and choke points in a fragile network. And they were talking about how to shut down the ports and shut down U.S. trade and domestic transportations, basically grind the gears of the economy down to a halt in order to build economic pressure, which would put a lot of social pressure on Trump to step down, to leave office. And whether he remained in office legitimately or illegitimately after that 2020 election, if he had officially won and stayed in power 100%, we would have seen a color revolution going into 2021. But those plans, they haven't gone anywhere. Those people haven't gone anywhere. They're still around. I think they're just waiting. That they need a certain level of support to be able to pull that off. At any rate, and then finally, the third pillar of how a color revolution attacks a government is by reducing a government's authority. So all this stuff about become ungovernable and not following these whatever laws Republicans pass, not implementing the laws and policies like arresting illegal immigrants. All these states and governors and mayors say we're not going to go along with that. That may not be an overt attempt exactly to reduce a government's authority, but that's the effect. So basically, if you have a majority of a country who believe that a president is no longer legitimate, the natural conclusion is that he needs to be replaced with someone who is legitimate. And if you turn the levers of government against the president so he can say whatever he wants, but he doesn't have the manpower or the money to implement his policies, And then if no one's following the laws or the edicts or the whatever dictates of a governmental leader, then this man is not long for this world. And so that's what they want to do. They can do that predominantly non-violently. And that's what a color revolution is. It's predominantly non-violent. It's people power. It's social power to build pressure. And you eventually force a leader of a country to step down into exile, or they'll resign or whatever.
And I know it's hard to predict. I mean, we still got a number of years to go. Anything can happen. I've heard a recent guest I had, Pastor Chuck Baldwin, say, hey, maybe J.D. Vance will take the helm in 2028. But let's say that, if you have any thought on Republicans continuing on after Trump with a Vance or one of Trump's children, thought on that, as well as what if the left comes back in? Do you think it'll just be like another Biden type woozy administration, or they'll do something insane and try to implement more tyranny?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure I'm up for President Don Jr., but JD Vance, I think there's a lot of younger guys. He can't be 80 years old. I mean, whoever the next presidential candidate, it has to be like 50 or below, basically, I think. So if there is another, they call him Trumpist or whatever, if there's another MAGA type Republican nominee in 2028, and I think if he wins and continues the policies, I think there's some people in this country will breathe a sigh of relief. They say, we get the policies that we actually want, because I think America is still a center-right country. We get the more conservative policies that we want, with none of the baggage and with none of the uncertainty and none of the hallmarks, Trumpist hallmarks of a Trump administration. But yeah, there will be people on the left that I think just say, we are not going to do this for 4 more years, and maybe 8 more years. We're not going to do it. So when I see these mass mobilization protests, not only building, but when I see prominent Democrats, like you mentioned, J.B. Pritzker, he said, we cannot give these Republicans a moment of rest. And he says, I've never called for mass mobilization protests in my life, but I'm calling for it now. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. And you have Senator Chris Murphy last month during a town hall calling calling for mass mobilization protests. And he says, we need, quote unquote, he says, we need to take exceptional tactics against the Trump administration. Last weekend, he said, there's not going to be a 2028 election if we don't win this fight right now. And so they are trying to ratchet up and escalate the rhetoric. And they're doing that because they think if they build enough, if they have mass mobilization protests, they're going to be able to put political, social, and eventually economic pressure against the Trump administration. It's not going to work. Trump is not going to be dissuaded by protests. So what does that mean? It means they have to escalate to direct action. They have to get physically involved. Civil disobedience, try to cause crisis. When you're like, if you look at an actual armed insurgency like Iraq or Afghanistan, those guys wake up every day and they say, okay, not just how can we kill Americans? How can we make the Americans overreact or overrespond and piss off more people? And I look at the left today with talking about direct action and civil disobedience, and that they have to wake up every single day and they say, how can we provoke an overreaction from the Trump administration? And that's going to piss a lot more people off. And I think that's why we get all these federal judges issuing these injunctions, not allowing Trump to do anything, because they are trying to provoke an overreaction. Why? Because that's going to make more people angry, and it's going to make more people believe that Trump is a dictator. And so I think they are trying to force us into this situation. And if Democrats take the House in 2026, they're going to have a lot more political power to do that as well. So I think this is something that we are seeing. And just when you look at color revolutions, they almost always coincide with an election, which is why I don't think it's going to happen this year. I don't think it can happen this year, but 2028, sure.
And they don't always succeed either. I wrote my master's thesis on color revolution, and we've seen the past 2 decades abroad. They've worked in some places, and sometimes they don't work. I've told this story before. I lived in Kazakhstan, 2017, a couple of years teaching, and I warned the government there of a U.S. color revolution. And I believe it was attempted in January of 2022, and it failed. It's still not sure. I mean, I'm still. I did a solo podcast on this, and it's still not clear even if that was a color revolution. So it may have been a color revolution. It could have been an internal coup. I mean, that's the thing with color revolutions. There's just so shady. It's so, such a black operation that you don't know who or what, what's the nature of it. And so, and I'm sure our adversaries would also love, right, if America was having these internal troubles. Yeah, that would make us much weaker and give China more opportunity, maybe to take Taiwan or something. No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Actually, in December 2020, the U.S. Army produced a facility security report that said, it didn't name China specifically, but it said foreign actors will use quote unquote conventional and unconventional means to attack the homeland. And they said they would do this through transnational criminal organizations. They would do this through cyber attacks, and they would do this through protest groups and like civil unrest. And so, yeah, like people ask me all the time, oh, how deeply is the left funded, and are these fake protests, and are the Tesla firebombers, or are they being paid by George Soros? And like you said, there are organic domestic protest movements. No one has to pay 65-year-old Karen with purple hair to go out and protest. She'll do that for free. No one's going to pay this 38-year-old guy to go firebomb some Teslas. He'll do that for free because of his ideology and hatred. So a lot of this stuff, most of these guys are not being paid. But yeah, if you are a country like China, and there is obviously an opportunity to use forms of irregular warfare to tie up resources, tie up attention from internal disputes while they are trying to achieve their geopolitical objectives. I'll just say this too. We can even go back to that 1990s manual it's effectively a manual called Unrestricted Warfare. And the Chinese are basically saying, they don't say this explicitly, but this is what you get from it. They have to force the United States into a strategic dilemma where the United States chooses national survival over its geopolitical objectives. And so, that's kind of the horns of the dilemma. You start asking yourself, what can China do to embroil us in a domestic conflict, to where you have a government that says, well, we either win this domestic conflict and ignore China, or we lose this domestic conflict and we lose to both. And that makes perfect sense. Now, whether China can pull it off, I'm not sure, but yeah, I mean, it's rational.
I do also want to get your thought. We talked about Vance, the technology aspect, the technocratic aspect, which I talk about a lot, the techno oligarchy, and it seems like this is just how things are now, in East and West, in Russia, in China, in the EU, in the US. Our governments now are. We've got Silicon Valley. China has its own version. All countries are deploying AI, digitizing everything, and that's just how it is. And but I'm just not a fan of this sort of dystopian road that we're going down. And I could see on one sense, if you're an American in America, hey, maybe you can get good jobs working in the AI industry and big tech and Silicon Valley, and that's just what everyone else is doing, and that's what the countries now have to work in this new economy, the fourth industrial revolution, fifth industrial revolution. But I also fear the dystopian aspect. You got Peter Thiel and Palantir and drones and Anduril, Palmer Luckey, and how long before Skynet becomes self-aware and starts drone bombing us? I've actually been considering. I just had this thought this week. Supposedly we're in the Trump administration, and now there's free speech. The Department of Homeland Security banned me from PayPal. It's like, can I call up the DHS and say, can you guys unban me now from PayPal? Because I've called PayPal and they just run me in circles. And so do you have any fear with the techno elite in the U.S. that they might overshoot the mark, overstep bounds, and bring us all into dangerous dystopian territory?
Yeah, I do. I share that concern. I look at it almost like with the invention of the automobile. You have a certain portion of society that says those things are death traps. They're way more dangerous than horses. Anybody could literally just drive a car and ram into you and kill you. And now we all drive cars without a second thought. So I think there is some trepidity just around the uncertainty of AI. Have you read the book The Sovereign Individual by any chance?
No, my recent guest, Jeremy Severy, who's the internationalist guy, he mentioned that. I haven't read that yet.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. They point out that basically the West goes through these 500-year metapolitical shifts. And you read it and you're like, yeah, okay, that's plausible. I get that. You move from anarchy to feudalism to the industrial age, and the industrial age into the information age. And they actually, it's I wouldn't say it's utopic, but they describe a world in the next 500 years, which started in 2000. They describe kind of the next 500 years as nation states are going away. We are going to look back on this concept of what you pay taxes to a nation state so you can be a citizen. That's going to be as antiquated as you used to give up 40% of your produce to your lord, or whatever, so he would protect you, like the feudalism. They make the case much better than I can. However, it's a compelling argument, I think. And so they kind of describe this kind of more utopic thing. Nation states go away, and what you get is city states or these enclaves. And they talk about cyber money. This was written back in the 1990s. And, those were the early pioneers, but, today we call them cryptocurrencies or crypto assets. And they say because the immutability of cryptocurrencies, nation states are not going to be able to confiscate it like they can a bank account. You can't go in and freeze someone's private wallet or, cold storage. And so basically they're like, people are just going to start hiding massive amounts of wealth from these nation states, and the nation states are going to collapse, are going to buckle under the weight of their sovereign debt, which we may be on the cusp of right now. And so I'm quite hopeful, honestly. Just like with any new technology, there are going to be some failures. There are things that need to be hammered out. But in the long term, I'm actually quite optimistic about AI, how AI can transform our lives and in many ways probably make it better. And I really like the idea of these enclaves that compete for this is not just like, hey, I'm going to move here and live off the system. You have to be a high productivity citizen. And in reward, there's going to be low taxes, maximum freedom. You're going to be protected in these city states by these, I guess we'll have AI drones and whatever. And, it's a good book. And I would like to know where these things are going to, or maybe, and this is something that Balaji and the network state people talk about as well. I mean, they're trying to physically build these things. So, I'll just end it here. I'm optimistic that this can actually be transformative in a good way rather than I don't know. I guess it's kind of like any technology. It can be misused. And so will there be dystopian tech, authoritarian AI powered gulags? Yeah. I mean, of course there will. Will there be the opposite? And I think, yeah, probably there will.
Yeah, I think it's unclear. And yeah, I got the e-version of Sovereign Individual, so I got to read that. And I've been talking about these network states and I've interviewed a few experts on that, and they talk about cyber states, network states. As you said, city states, the Elysian, there's the Substack that seems to be promoting this globalist version of this. They reference Jefferson's, ward republics, village states. And so it's just fascinating. But, I think it's not going to be a smooth ride either for them, because we see them trying to implement a lot of this technocratic stuff, and it's just not working. Whether in India, the Aadhaar system, stuff keeps getting hacked, and there's still so many loopholes for us to use. So I do think it is, as you say, that they will try. They will probably succeed in some ways, but we'll still have like black markets and ways to work around. And that future is unclear. Let me ask you about the economy real quick. The tariffs, inflation is insane. You've talked about the dollar confidence crisis. There's this talk of de-dollarization. I don't know what it feels like they're doing this Hail Mary with the Bitcoin strategic reserve and digital dollar. I've posited it again. I don't know. I feel like I'm on the fence where they might try to back the dollar with Bitcoin or whatever they're doing with Tether and stable coins, and that could fail and collapse and lead to the collapse of the dollar, or they could succeed and it becomes like a Bretton Woods 3.0, where we go from gold-backed dollar to oil-backed dollar and now to energy Bitcoin-backed dollar. And so I feel like it can go either way, or it could just be a long. People have said, Jeff Sachs came out and said, within 10 years, CBDCs will kill the dollar, and once each country gets their CBD systems operational and interoperable, that makes SWIFT obsolete and the dollar. And so, just on the economy, how do you see the state of things with tariffs and all that, inflation, dollar?
Well, it's something that's aspirational by the Trump administration, I think, in a good way. I wish him all the luck. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, this was before he became Treasury Secretary. He said, well, this is when Trump was still on the campaign trail. He said, I think, this is almost a quote. He said, I think there's a good chance that, or like, we have the opportunity to build a Bretton Woods 3.0 or the next Bretton Woods. And he said, and I want to be a part of that. So this is absolutely strategically transformational for the U.S. monetary system. It's if they succeed, it's going to be rough. Maybe this is the problem of having, and I'm not arguing against 2 and 4 year election cycles, but it's hard to make long-term strategic changes when you have no more than 2 years to do it before your party gets swept out of power in the legislature, and then maybe they boot you out in less than 4 years. So this Scott Bessent talks about this Fortress North America. Basically, let's get economic cooperation and trade aligned between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And let's get that aligned. And basically, we have a military unassailable, monetarily, financially unassailable stronghold. Lots of natural resources. And maybe, this, you mentioned the North American Union. Maybe we're like headed towards that anyway. But I think Fortress North America is a very interesting concept. I think that's probably where our economy is headed at like a geoeconomic level. Those are my initial thoughts. I don't know if you want something more specific.
No, I think, yeah. And I mean, would you see the dollar going away? I mean, it's kind of like you said, Britain didn't go away. It's just there. The Mexican peso died, and then it's died, I don't know how many times, the Mexican peso, but here we are still using it. It was reset in the 90s. And so, yeah, it's like it's kind of like a reset. It goes to zero and you restart the computer, right? And life continues on. So I think a lot of these collapse scenarios are a bit too science fiction-y, where, yeah, there might be look at Russia. Russia had a couple of years. It was horrible. A lot of people died, but they're back up and at them. No?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the dollar, well, on a long enough timeline, no currency survives. I guess gold has survived. I don't know enough about the strategic Bitcoin reserve. I think the government should not sell off its Bitcoin. I think the federal government should keep its Bitcoin. I like Bitcoin. Let's just face facts here. It is surprising to see that the dollar and treasuries have made it this long. Everyone talks about $37 trillion in public debt. We have $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. I know a lot of people are talking about capital rotation out of the United States, and Europe is repatriating their money. They're selling off of U.S. assets because they think it's unstable, and they don't like Trump, and so they're, whether it's a protest vote, they're putting their money where their mouth is, or they just say we're gonna move our euro dollars back home. I don't know, whatever, but yeah, that's happening. But I think so. Where I was going with that is I think treasuries are still The debate is whether the dollar and treasuries are still safe haven assets. And I think in the near term they are. It's not that there will not be a competitor. It's just that there is no better competitor right now. There's no good competitor. But that said, I think the dollar is headed down over the longer term. Obviously, treasuries are headed down over the longer term. You're going to get to a point where someone says, how in the world are you going to buy 30-year treasuries because of what's happening in the United States right now? And Deutsche Bank has been one of the ones kind of beating this drum, saying, they're not explicitly saying this, but they're saying like, hey, the United States is going to start having treasury problems. And we're talking about maybe like failed bond auctions due to lack of demand. And they're talking about changing the way, basically increasing the amount of U.S. treasuries that the primary dealer banks can buy, because foreign investors are going to stop buying, not stop, but foreign investors have been buying less and selling off more treasuries. And so that's going to impact interest rates. That's going to impact all the, I'm not like a financial whiz or whatever, but I just look at all that, the long-term strategic trends for the dollar and treasuries, and I say, it's got to be replaced with something at some point.
Yeah, I see it the same as well. You mentioned Mexico. I do want to ask you about that. I'm often thinking about that. I'm down here in Mexico. You're in Texas, formerly part of Mexico. But in the end, it won't matter because we're all going to become one happy family: Canada, USA, Mexico, Greenland, Panama, and so forth. But the situation with the border, the migration, and the cartels, and look, I gotta. One thing that bothers me, you've seen some of these people who are like hyper BRICS and multipolar folks, and they're like cheerleaders for Xi Jinping and Putin. And they say they could do no wrong. Things are wonderful. It's all roses and unicorns in China and Russia. And I'm like, and they're not even Russians or Chinese. They're these foreign, alt media personalities. And I'm thinking, look, well, I'm here in Mexico. That would be like me saying in Mexico, well, everything's fine. There's no cartels, there's no heads being chopped. I'm like, are you serious? And so my point is like, we got to be honest. And so life is wonderful here in Mexico. It's low cost of living. It's sunny. I've been here for over a decade. So yes, that's true. But there are these crazy cartels. Like I hear stories from people. My first home was broken into 3 times. I've had a coworker, kidnapped. They dissolve people in barrels of acid. They dismembered bodies. Have
you heard about the latest thing where they're on the subway and they like poke people with a syringe and squirt them full of some chemical and they like get dazed out? I was just having this conversation with a Mexican national earlier this week. He said like that's the new thing on the subways or something.
I'd assume in Mexico City, probably.
Yeah, Mexico City. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard that, but I wouldn't doubt it. So it's like, if you kind of mind your own business, you have good situational awareness, you should be all right. Most people that I know have been all right, but this stuff is going on and it's insane. And the cartels, they hijack 50 semis a day. Like how's the Mexican? I just published this. I shared this story yesterday. There was the World Bank, OECD. I'm trying to pull it up on my personal X account where I shared it. Says it's like Captain Obvious. Organized crime is hindering economic growth in America and in Mexico as it is throughout Latin America. World Bank. It's like, well, duh. And people on the lower socioeconomic ring, set up shop. Someone I knew literally like 2 months ago, they were hired to open up a little stall here in Guadalajara. The next day, 2 guys approach demanding the monthly tax, narco tax. I've heard people tell me like, oh yeah, my brother had his car stolen. He had the Apple AirTag in it. He knew exactly where it was. We called the Mexican police and the police are like, we'll retrieve it for you, but only for $2,000. And it's just kind of like, so this stuff is going on. What's your thought when it comes to the cartel crisis, the border, and there's this talk of launching airstrikes on cartels. And look, I'm no fan of U.S. foreign intervention, but we always get placed in between a rock and a hard place. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's a really bad thing. I've even heard Mexicans, patriotic Mexicans say like, yeah, we got to do something about these cartels. We kind of like, we'd be okay with U.S. airstrikes on the cartels. What's your thought regarding the security situation when it comes to migration, borders, and all that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of wish that we had spent instead of wasting, whatever trillions of dollars trying to remake the Middle East, we just spend, half of that and remade Mexico. Maybe, I don't know. So, yeah, I dislike. I mean, let's be honest. Mexico, I think is basically a failed state in many areas because the national government does not have control over most of the states, many of the states. And AMLO was in bed with the cartels, and AMLO, what he tried to do with the National Institute for Elections, and try to basically implement one party rule by Morena, and then Scheinbaum is doing the exact same thing. I think that's a problem that starts at the top. I mean, this hugs not bullets stuff doesn't work. Obviously, doesn't work. It's just a way for Morena just to not have to deal with the cartel problem. I mean, that's my perspective from reading the news and following Mexican politics. So I think that's I think it's a government problem. But I think I think there's that show Narcos, and on I think it was on Netflix, and there's this DEA agent that goes down to Bogota or wherever he is, and he's saying like, oh, the Colombian government, the U.S. government needs the government of Colombia to do more to fight the drug trafficking. And the Colombian, whatever he was, turns around and says, if Americans weren't buying cocaine, we wouldn't have a cartel problem in Colombia. And so I think that's another part of it is, you just have a insatiable demand for drugs in the United States. And of course you're going to get these cartels. And so I think that's the other problem that needs to be tackled. So it's not easy. It's not messy. I think with military strikes, the best you can do is like mow the grass, as the Israelis say. You just, you beat back the cartels, you kill a bunch of them, you wreck their drug labs, you set them back, but they're not going to disappear. As long as there are illegal ways to make money, they're going to find it. And whether that's drugs or, human trafficking or whatever, or if they just go full North Korea and start hacking Bitcoin exchanges. So at any rate, yeah, I think the military strikes, whatever. You're going to beat them back for a while, but you're not going to solve it through. It's not a military solvable problem.
Well, and what you said about Americans consuming drugs, but now it's kind of to the point where, like, okay, avocados. I mean, now they're. It's the craziest stories. Like there were lime farmers just gave up because they're coming and saying, basically, give us all of your profits for growing lime. It's like, what the hell? I quit. Like I can't even grow. Can't even make a living growing limes. And then they send in the National Guard, and it's just absolutely insane. And so it's everywhere now beyond just drugs. It's limes, it's avocado, it's everything. And it's this disease that has metastasized, this corruption in Mexico. And no one, as you said, no one in the state has the balls to do anything about it. And the ones that do, they get whacked. Was it this year, last year, 30, 40 politicians whacked? And so, yeah, that's an issue. I worry. Do you think if there was some war that started between U.S. and Mexico, and it wouldn't be maybe against like the U.S. government, Mexican government, it'd be the U.S. military against the cartels. Do you think that could spill over to U.S. like Rambo 5 style? Or
well, yeah, I mean it could. I've had this debate with guys on our early warning team about what the cartels would do in response. Whether I think some people believe that the cartels would just go like straight Al Qaeda in the United States and just start like attacking shopping malls and stuff. And I don't know the cartels that well. I don't know whether they're going to do it. I don't think that's very rational for them to do. But yeah, I mean, we already see cartel violence spilling over into the United States. I spent a while in El Paso, and I was talking to somebody, and he said, "Oh, that's where all the major cartel guys live." And I was like, "Oh, how do you know that?" He's like, or I was like, "Oh, because it's a rich area?" He's like, "No, because there's like no crime over there. Like nobody messes with these dudes." Like so. At any rate, we know a bunch of them are here. They live here and they operate here. And from time to time, some state law enforcement agency will find a duffel bag with a head in it or something. It's obviously like a cartel hit. I think listen. We learned this lesson the hard way in Afghanistan with Pakistan. if you have a bordering nation that is not serious about helping you solve a problem, and in some cases you have Pakistanis actively aiding the Taliban, which is what you get in Mexico, except it's not the Taliban, it's some whatever the cartels they support. Until the Mexican government gets serious about it, it's everything's just going to leak like a sieve. So I'm not sure how realistic it is that Mexico will ever throw off the chains of Morena. And it's not like the PAN or anyone else is that better. I don't know who like the Trump Mexican candidate, I don't know, would be. But until you get a Mexican government that's serious about solving the problem will not be solved.
Yeah, it probably would be Eduardo Verástegui. But he wasn't able to get on the ballot last time. But who knows? You mentioned Pakistan. I do want to just before we close out ask you about the specter of world war, because you've got you may have mentioned Thucydides' trap in one of your recent videos for early warning, but you get the Ukraine thing, as we mentioned earlier, that might be being put on hold for now. You've got the Iran situation, Taiwan, India, Pakistan. We just looked at U.S., Mexico. Do you think just any thought here? Did you fear a third world war scenario? Or we're not there yet. Is it just something that's building up over time? Just what's your sort of where are you at right now when it comes to this escalation potential?
Mm-hmm. Well, I am concerned about a conflict between the United States and China, not just obviously a trade war, but an actual armed conflict. I think the best advice that I've ever gotten is you start with a historical baseline. Okay. The question is, will X event happen by X date? Will the United States and China be in an armed conflict by 2030? And you go back throughout history and you say, well, how many times have the United States and China gone to war with each other? Well, it's not zero, number one. So we can look back at all these historical trends, and Graham Allison's talked about this. He calls it the Thucydides trap. He says throughout history, going back to the Greeks, Athens and Sparta, he said 70% of the time a revisionist power challenges a status quo power, it results in war. So China is the revisionist power. The United States is a status quo power. Okay, we start with the baseline. 70% of the time that happens results in war. Like, okay, not great. Like not inevitable, but not great. There's another fantastic book by a dude named Dale Copeland. It's called Economic Interdependence and War. And what he did is he looked at the history of great powers that were economically interdependent on each other. And what he found is 90% of the time when economically interdependent great powers develop future negative trade expectations, 90% of the time results in war. This whole liberal thing is like, hey, if we're just economically interdependent with all these countries, we have globalism that reduces the likelihood of war. Like no one's going to act against their own best interest. No one's going to disrupt their own supply chains to go to war with each other. And that just obviously is not true. And what Dale Copeland does is he adds this kind of third variable here, which is trade expectations. And again, just to reiterate, what he found is 90% of the time that when two countries have negative future trade expectations, they go to war because they're incentivized to go to war. Because you have country A that's dependent on country B, because country A buys everything from country B and country B sells everything to country A. And 10 years ago, this was China. This is no longer China anymore. Chinese exports are like 10 to 15%. U.S. exports from China are like 10 to 15% of all Chinese exports. But we are still economically interdependent because of our critical manufacturing needs. So at any rate, I think I just look at that as like, that's a second baseline indicator is 90%. So we're dealing with 70 and 90%, like not great. And then, we look at China's aims on Taiwan and not just Taiwan, but the entire first island chain and the second island chain. We have a mutual defense agreement with the Philippines. They're part of the first island chain. We have this massive defense cooperation agreement with Japan. They're part of the first island chain. So I'm very, very concerned about a world war with Indo-Pacific allies versus China.
Yeah, you mentioned the revisionist powers. That made me think of World War I. I read in William Engdahl's book. It was a bestseller. His first book, Century of War, I think. And he said, one of the reasons there perhaps was the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Germany was the rising revisionist power and Britain the declining one. And bam, There you go. And, Mike Adams, Health Ranger, he just posted today. He says, this is not a drill. What Americans need to understand, Trump just announced any country buying oil from Iran will be banished from conducting any trade with America. Well, China gets its oil from Iran, and that could create the U.S., the scenario for Pearl Harbor, with what U.S. did, cut off a lot of oil from Japan, and that forces someone to hit first. And so, yeah, I'd agree with you. So given everything we've covered, we could have unrest in the United States because of the left. We could have cartel stuff. You could have, the economic strife, tariffs, China, war with China. So all these different threats. You mentioned becoming ungovernable. So I always like to ask my guests, what can one do to protect oneself, become ungovernable? One of my recent guests said, de-state, so become as less reliable on the state as possible. And I think what you're doing with early warning, what I try to do is for people to get early warnings to figure out where to extrapolate where the trends are headed so they can then make the correct decision. So just thoughts on what people can do to survive and thrive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the first thing we ought to do is, we don't have, we're all intelligence and special operations veterans at early warning. And that leaves us a certain vulnerability or limitation because we've looked through a lot of things through a military or like civilian intelligence lens. And so I think the first thing we ought to do is we ought to gather probably like 3 to 5, 4 to 6 people, yourself included, and have a discussion and just offer different perspectives. You live in Mexico, I live in the United States, and intelligence is one area where diversity is actually a real strength. So and even then it's diversity of thought. So I think that's the first thing that people can do is expose yourself to new perspectives. Do not get trapped in groupthink. Do not get trapped in any sort of fatalism. And you got to pop your own bubble. I think that's the first thing. The second thing you got to do is be as self-sustainable as you can, starting with water, food, and controlling your body temperature, whether that's heat or cold. You try to reduce your dependency on anything beyond your control. That's the second thing you got to do. The third thing you got to do is build community. You got to build political, social, and economic power for yourself at the local level. So it doesn't matter what they decide in Beijing. It doesn't matter whatever dictates come from DC or your state capital. You've got your local crew. You have local political power. You got local social power. You got local economic power. You can keep the good stuff in and the bad stuff out, and focus on your sphere of influence. Identify the things that you can control and exert the most amount of pressure and influence on the things that you see as a priority, and kind of not forget about the rest, but they're just some things that you're not going to control. I think being realistic about what you can influence and what you can't is another part of that. So I'd say broadly, those are like my 3 or 4 things.
Very sound advice, and it overlaps with some of what other guests say. And I think, again, community, you can't do this alone. I mean, no, you got to have some, people look to expatriate to different countries. And I'm like, do you speak the language? Do you have heritage? Do you know anybody? That's, it's going to be, and it depends on how old you are. I'm kind of like at that stage where I'm done going to new countries, been there and done that. I'm tired. Really good stuff. Mike, your links are in the description. Again, tell us where the best places for people to go to follow you, and how to subscribe to the Substack, or they can become members of the Early Warning Network. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Great discussion. I'd like to pick your brain as well at some point in the future. So if you want to join a community of people who are focused on emergency preparedness and trying to understand these strategic level events and boil it down to the local level, then join Early Warning Network. Not only do you get a daily intelligence briefing we produce every morning, that we cover everything from the food supply to economics and finance to what's going on in the South China Sea, what's going on politically. We cover the far left almost every day, like domestic protests and stuff. You can do that at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. And then if you just want a weekly sit rep about the far left, I run a newsletter on Substack called Gray Zone Research. And
I've been tracking these May Day protests. The next big day is June 14th. That's like the next big national day of action. So that's something I'm paying attention to now. And that's it. grayzoneresearch.substack.com.
Okay, yeah, the links are in the description. And who knows, maybe if I pass through Texas one of these days, we can hang out. Last time I was there for the first time ever. 2 years ago, I went to the Ron Paul Institute conference. I was actually invited to Ron Paul's house, but couldn't make it, having been a sponsor of the institute. But anyways, keep up the great work, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.